anybody in the USA want to adopt me as soon as possible, because look at the price of an American house versus a British house.
What is this propeller?
What? No, it's just a fan.
A fan?
Yeah.
That's so dangerous. What if it falls on top of you?
This is the most shocking thing in the house. What's this? There's one in the bathroom. You are asking to be electrocuted.
Across Europe, a pattern keeps repeating. Travelers come home from the United States and start looking at their own homes differently. A closet that once felt normal now feels small. A summer they always tolerated now feels unbearable. Laundry that used to take 2 days now feels like a waste of a life. It shows up in forums, in comment sections, in the same sentence over and over. I didn't know it could be different until I saw it. Nobody expects a house to change how someone thinks about their entire life. But ask enough Europeans what surprised them most in America, and the same 5 things keep coming up. Not mansions, not marble, nothing that would ever make a luxury listing. Ordinary rooms and machines that most Americans have never once thought to be proud of, because no one ever told them these were the exception, not the rule. That gap between what America stopped noticing and what the rest of the world still lives without is exactly where this story begins. 5 features, 5 reasons they exist. And by the end, you may find yourself looking at your own house the same way those visitors looked at theirs, wondering how something so ordinary went unnoticed for so long. Let's start with the first one, the one every visitor notices before they even set down their bags. The first thing a European visitor notices about an American home is rarely a feature at all. It's the absence of one, the absence of walls. Rooms that would normally be separated by doors and hallways in Europe simply flow into each other. Kitchen into dining area into living room, one continuous space large enough to lose a conversation in. For a visitor raised on defined rooms, each with its own closed door and its own function, it can feel less like a house and more like an entire floor, with the walls left out by mistake. For most of their lives, this kind of space was something they had filed away as unnecessary, a very American form of excess, built for people who simply had more money than sense of restraint. The average new home in the United States runs close to 2,400 square feet. In much of Europe, that number sits closer to 1,000 or 1,300. A family in Munich or Lisbon can raise children, host holidays, and live a full life in a footprint less than half the size of a typical American suburban build. And for generations, that was simply accepted as how homes were supposed to work. Efficient, compact, nothing wasted. So the instinct, at first, is to dismiss the difference as indulgence. But the explanation isn't indulgence, it's arithmetic. European cities were largely built before the automobile, packed tightly within old city walls, with land passed down through families for centuries, and never available in the quantities modern building requires. American suburbs, by contrast, expanded across open land after the Second World War. At a moment when lumber was cheap, land was cheaper, and there was no ancient street grid to work around. Building bigger wasn't a display of wealth. It was simply what the land and the materials allowed. What changes a visitor's mind isn't the number on a floor plan. It's the first morning spent inside one. Waking up in a guest room, walking through a kitchen large enough for 3 people to cook without colliding, stepping onto a private lawn without a shared wall in sight. Visitors describe it less as luxury and more as something closer to room to breathe. Not bigger for the sake of bigger, but bigger in a way that quietly removes 100 small frictions they never realized they were living with. And that is precisely the moment the certainty starts to crack. Because once someone has lived inside that kind of space, however briefly, going home to a kitchen where 2 people can't pass each other stops feeling normal and starts feeling like a limitation they'd simply never had the chance to notice before. It is easy to assume this is where the story ends. More land, more space, more house. But size alone doesn't explain why a European in the middle of a heat wave will look at an American home with something closer to disbelief. Because the next feature isn't about how much space Americans built. It's about how they made that space livable in conditions most of the rest of the world still simply endures. The second thing a European visitor learns about American homes usually arrives without warning. In the middle of July, the moment they step through the front door and feel the temperature drop 10 degrees before they've even said hello. Somewhere behind a wall, a machine has already decided the house will be comfortable all day in every room without anyone touching a switch or opening a window. For a visitor from London, Berlin, or Rome, this isn't just convenience. It's a small shock to a belief they didn't know they held. That summer was simply something a person endured. For most of their lives, air conditioning sat in their minds as a peculiarly American habit, slightly wasteful, slightly unnecessary, the kind of comfort people reach for when they've never had to think twice about the cost of running it. Nearly 90% of American homes have some form of air conditioning. In Europe, that number sits closer to 20%, and in some countries far lower still, roughly 5% in the United Kingdom, barely 3% in Germany. For decades, that gap was framed as a matter of restraint, even principle. Cooler summers, older buildings, a general sense that surviving a few hot weeks a year built character rather than justified an appliance. Then the summers changed. Heat waves that once arrived rarely now return year after year, pushing temperatures past levels European homes were ever designed to handle. Millions of people in houses built long before anyone imagined a need for cooling have been left with little more than an open window and a fan pushing hot air from one room to another. It is in exactly this moment, mid-heatwave, unable to sleep, watching a fan do nothing, that the old certainty starts to wear thin. And it's often around that same time that a memory resurfaces. The guest room in Ohio, the office in Texas, the hotel in Florida, where the air simply stayed cool no matter what was happening outside. What Americans rarely stop to consider is that this wasn't purely a matter of choice either. Central air conditioning became standard in the United States largely because it arrived at the exact moment suburbs were being built from scratch. Homes and neighborhoods designed with cooling systems built in from day one, rather than retrofitted into structures built centuries earlier. It is less a triumph of comfort seeking and more a case of good timing meeting good infrastructure. But timing or not, the result is the same. An entire population that has never had to build its summer plans around the... That's the detail visitors carry home with them. Not the machine itself, but the freedom of never having to negotiate with the weather indoors. And that same freedom shows up again in the next feature, in a much more unassuming place. A door in the wall of the kitchen that leads, without a single step outside, straight into a two-car garage. For a European visitor, this is often the moment the trip stops feeling like sightseeing and starts feeling personal. Stepping out of a car in the rain and walking indoors without a coat, without an umbrella, without a single drop of water touching a bag of groceries, it's such a small mechanical convenience that it barely seems worth mentioning. And yet, it's one of the details visitors bring up again and again, almost apologetically, as if embarrassed by how much they miss it once they're home. For most of their lives, a private garage attached to the house was something they'd filed under American car culture, proof, they assumed, of a country more attached to its vehicles than its people. Roughly 2/3 of American homes have a garage or carport, and among new construction, that number climbs past 80%, most with room for 2 cars or more. In much of Europe, parking means the street, a shared lot, or if you're fortunate, a detached space several blocks from the front door. The assumption was simple: Americans just love their cars more. But that explanation misses what the garage actually became once it was built. It rarely stays a place for cars alone. It turns into a workshop, a tool bench, a place to store the lawnmower, the bicycles, the half-finished woodworking project, an entire second room that costs nothing extra to heat or furnish, tucked quietly onto the side of the house. It exists less because of a love of automobiles, and more because of a simple post-war reality. Land was open, houses were spread out, and the car had become the only practical way to reach any of it. The garage wasn't a luxury bolted onto the house. It was the logical answer to a country built at a scale no sidewalk could cover. What a visitor notices, standing in that garage for the first time, isn't the car. It's the sense of a household that has quietly solved a dozen small storage problems most European homes still juggle in hallways, basements, or rented lockers streets away. And once that convenience has been lived, even for a week, the idea of returning to a shared lot 2 blocks from the front door starts to feel less like normal life and more like an inconvenience they'd simply never had a name for. But the garage is still something visible, a room anyone can walk into and understand at a glance. The next feature is different. It's hidden entirely beneath the house, built for a reason most Americans have never once had to think about, and it may be the single most surprising discovery in this entire list. Not every discovery on this list announces itself the moment a visitor walks through the door. Some take a few days to surface, usually around the second or third load of laundry, when a European guest realizes they haven't seen a single clothesline, a drying rack, or a sweater draped over a radiator anywhere in the house. Just a machine, sitting quietly next to the washer, that turns a soaking wet load into folded ready clothes in under an hour. For most of their lives, this was filed away as another unnecessary American convenience, a machine built to solve a problem that never really needed solving, since clothes have dried on lines for thousands of years without anyone suffering for it. And the numbers seem to back up that assumption. Nearly 90% of American homes have a clothes dryer, while in much of Europe that number sits closer to 50%, with millions of households still relying on a rack by the window or a line strung across a balcony. For decades, this was framed less as a hardship and more as a virtue, a small daily ritual, gentler on the clothes, gentler on the electricity bill, and undeniably better for the environment. Then comes a rainy week, or a small apartment with no balcony, or a family of 4 generating more laundry than any drying rack can hold at once. Damp shirts draped over every chair and doorknob in the house, still not dry 2 days later. It's in that exact moment, waiting on a load of laundry the way one might wait on a delayed flight, that the old certainty starts to wobble. And it's often then that the memory resurfaces. A guest bathroom in Texas, a hallway closet in Ohio, where a full load went from soaking to folded before the coffee had even finished brewing. What rarely gets mentioned is that this convenience isn't really about laziness either. It's about time, the quiet, cumulative kind that adds up over a lifetime without ever being tallied. 2 days of waiting for something to dry doesn't sound like much on its own, but multiplied across every week, every year, for an entire household, it becomes hours that simply vanish. Hours an American household rarely has to spend thinking about laundry at all, because the problem resolves itself in a closet in under 60 minutes. That's the detail a visitor tends to carry home longer than almost any other on this list. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's so mundane. A closet, a machine, an hour. And yet, once that hour has been experienced instead of imagined, a rack full of half-dry shirts starts to feel less like a virtue and more like a task nobody ever gave them permission to skip. But everything so far, the space, the cooling, the garage, the laundry, has been something visible, something a visitor could reach out and touch. The last feature on this list is different. It's hidden entirely beneath the floor, built for a reason that has nothing to do with comfort at all. And it may be the strangest, most misunderstood room in the entire American house. Of everything on this list, nothing confuses a European visitor quite like the basement. Not because it's unfamiliar in concept, plenty of old European buildings have cellars, but because of how completely it seems to have vanished everywhere else in the world, while remaining almost a given across huge parts of the United States. An entire second floor hidden beneath the one everyone actually lives on, used for anything from a home gym to a spare bedroom to nothing more than a place to store what won't fit upstairs. For most of their lives, visitors assume this was simply another example of American appetite for space, as if one floor was never going to be enough. So why not dig for a second one? It fit neatly alongside everything else on this list. More room, more storage, more house than anyone strictly needed. And the assumption made sense right up until someone asked a contractor why the basement was there in the first place and got an answer that had nothing to do with wanting more space at all. In much of the northern and midwestern United States, the ground freezes every winter and frozen soil expands. A foundation built too close to the surface gets pushed and cracked by that movement, a process builders call frost heave, and it's brutal enough to destroy a house from below over just a few winters. To avoid it, foundations in these regions have to be dug deep, often 8 feet or more, well below the frost line. And once a crew has already dug a hole that size, pouring a floor and adding a ceiling costs relatively little extra. The basement isn't really a feature that was chosen. It's closer to a side effect of a problem the ground itself created, one that happened to come with a free room attached. That's what makes the contrast so telling. Travel to Florida or Texas, same country, similar building codes in many ways, and basements almost disappear entirely because the ground there barely freezes, and digging deep enough to matter just means filling a hole with groundwater instead. Same nation, completely different foundations, dictated by nothing more sentimental than soil and climate. It's rarely framed this way to homeowners, most of whom grew up believing the basement was simply where the washing machine and the holiday decorations lived, never once suspecting it was born out of a fight against frozen dirt. But the story doesn't end with foundations. In parts of the Midwest and the South, where tornadoes can form with only minutes of warning, that same underground space became the one room in the house where a family could reasonably expect to survive a storm the rest of the structure couldn't. Over time, it took on a second identity that had nothing to do with weather at all. A rec room, a home office, a teenager's first space of their own, the one room in an American house, never assigned a fixed purpose, and precisely for that reason, the one most families end up remembering the most. None of this is what a European visitor is thinking about the first time they're led down a set of basement stairs. What strikes them first is simply the fact that it exists at all. It's only later, once they learn the reason behind it, that the basement stops looking like an indulgence and starts looking like something closer to proof that even the most impressive parts of an American home are rarely the result of excess for its own sake, but of a country that kept finding ways to turn its problems. Frozen ground, sudden storms, a family that outgrew its own square footage into rooms nobody else in the world thought to build. None of these 5 features would make it onto a real estate listing as a selling point. No one photographs a garage door for the way it keeps rain off a bag of groceries. No one writes central air in bold letters expecting it to move someone to tears. And yet, somewhere between the open kitchen, the cool air, the dry garage, the folded laundry, and the quiet room underground, something does shift for the people who experience them firsthand. Not admiration for wealth, but a kind of recognition that a house can be built to remove friction most of the world has simply learned to live with. That may be the real reason the pattern keeps repeating. Travelers returning home unable to unsee what they once considered normal. It was never about square footage or machinery. It was about discovering that comfort, once experienced, doesn't ask for permission to be missed. A closet that felt fine a month ago now feels small. A summer once tolerated now feels unnecessary to endure. And somewhere in that quiet discomfort, a thought takes root that no brochure or listing ever put there. The sense that life could simply be arranged differently, and that someone, somewhere already decided to arrange it that way. Whether that thought turns into an actual move, or simply into a different way of looking at one's own front door, is something each person carries home on their own. But it rarely leaves entirely. And perhaps that's the real story here. Not that America built bigger houses, but that it built houses no one had to think twice about living in. Until someone from somewhere else find